Well, welcome to 2025, a new year, a new podcast episode. And so, hope everyone had a great break. So, today, the timely topic, actually, and the talk of the town is what the new administration is going to do in terms tech policies and then consequently cybersecurity policies. And Christy Nome, I heard, just had her confirmation hearing for the head of DHS. And I heard that there was discussion about where CISA is going to go, for instance. Is CISA going to stay or someplace else? And how big a priority cybersecurity is going to be for the administration? And anybody has a comment or sort of a general prediction of where the new administration with the new DHS head, where are they going to go in terms of cybersecurity policies?
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in. I think that having watched the last few administrations come through, cybersecurity is less politicized than a lot of other categories. And so, and that's the way we like it. The one area that we need to be careful of and keep an eye on is this area that we don't really talk about much because it's not really in the purview of most security executives, and that's the content moderation. The one area where CISA kind of, I think, in the last 4 years got in the political kind of spotlight was around that topic. And, 99% of people who work in cybersecurity don't think about content moderation, but CISA was asked to do so, I think, by the last administration.
I think Jim would disagree. He works in a company that has a lot of user-generated content.
Right,
Yes.
and he's the 1%. And I know I used to be in the 1% as the CSO at Facebook and also as a senior leader at eBay. Dealing with user generated content it's a really complicated space, and most security leaders don't have to deal with it and run away from it when they see it coming. CISA didn't run away from it when they saw it coming because they don't really have that choice, and that is the one area that I think has, I guess, in the eyes of Republicans, tarnished their brand. So, like if you go back to 2016 when the first Trump administration came in, actually, I guess they started in 2017. And the big thing was I was on President Obama's Cyber Commission in 2016. We finished our report and recommendations after Trump was elected. And so our recommendations were from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, basically like, here's the things that we think are working well, and here's the things that aren't, and we would love to see you prioritize. When I got together years later with those other commissioners and we look back, we see that the Trump administration continued to move the ball forward on pretty much everything that, we didn't get worse as a country on cybersecurity between 2016 and 2020. We didn't do, I mean, CISA came into being during that time period. There was if you go back to 2016, one of the bad things was that, there were 100 different agencies who were fighting over who was responsible for cyber. If you had an incident in 2015, you didn't know if you should call the Secret Service, the FBI, or some random phone number at DHS.
Who'd have called now?
Who do you call?
Right, but who do I call? Not them.
Right.
I'm not trying to rip on a specific agency. Let me be clear. I share intelligence with agencies when something's going down, but we're moving at the speed of an incident, which is rather fast. And so, I'm calling you or Vitali or, others that we know in other places that are more frontline. Government generally is informed by us. They're not, I've never gotten a heads up from government. Okay, that's not true. I'm not being fair.
Yeah,
It's
but let me give you an example. Like Log4j happened during this past administration, the Biden administration, probably like a year in, right? 2020, something like that. CISA stepped in and played a quarterbacking role, got a lot of information from the companies that were really working on it, and kind of pushed out to the rest of the cybersecurity world some best practices. Um, Before CISA, we didn't have that type of stuff. That was, you know, companies like uh, the ones that you both lead security at. You have to be on top of that stuff. You can't wait for a government. You can't wait for a government agency to come in and help you. But it's all those other smaller companies that don't have the same level of pressure. They needed CISA to step in situations like that, and I think CISA has, and so we don't want CISA to go away. Um, I think we would like that CISA's role in mis and disinformation to maybe go away, so that those two categories of work don't get so clouded. And
I mean, Vitaly, let you talk in a second. I just want to get this out that did a decent amount of damage, that court ruling uh, against CISA, because then FBI literally stopped talking, not even responding to texts or anything like that, because they didn't know what to do. DOJ, everybody's sealed up. And so threat intel went to zero. And I'm talking about me sharing that way.
You, can you repeat the court hearing? You were talking about the court hearing that against CISA. Maybe you can refer to it so that our listener will know what you're talking about
Yeah.
specifically.
When CISA had the injunction or whatever it was, a court ruling about their involvement in social media, it had a wider blast radius than just CISA, right? FBI, other people just stopped talking, DOJ, because they didn't know how to handle talking to us and they didn't want to break the rules. And so it was almost like a mini Snowden in some ways, just in the other direction.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a bad thing for the industry, because you want intelligence to come from the government, and maybe, as Joe said, the two of you are so on top of your game. Maybe you don't, but many other companies I know that benefited from.
They rely on it. Yeah. Jenksy, you were talking about Christie's confirmation earlier. I just saw a little snippet of it. She actually did mention CISA in her confirmation.
Yeah.
And how, in her view, it got off kind of their core mission. And I think she talked about misinformation, what Joe was actually referring to. So she called kind of to shrink CISA, but I don't think she really says shrink the agency, but she said that it needs to be refocused back on protecting critical infrastructure, the federal, and not focus on social or misinformation. So we probably will see some shifts, right, in kind of their priorities. But I think even with new administration, everybody understands that we need something in place. So I don't think they're going to defund CISA than some people were worried about, right? It's just going to be refocused on protecting critical infrastructure, intel sharing. It's going to be interesting to see.
And I think that is what we want CISA to be, right? And correct me if I'm wrong,
That's
but
right.
those are the most critical missions, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And do you so I I was just at this conversation, they talked about her hearing, and one of the things that mentioned was that they believe from the hearing questions, they believe that the administration is going to leave it up to her to make some of the decisions about maybe new policies or whether to restructure CISA, and how to work with the other agencies. And sounds like what they should do. But do you expect, you guys know some of the government initiatives better than I do. Do you expect the second term in Trump administration, are they going to be legislating more national level cybersecurity policies than they have done in the past?
I don't think so. If anything, like when we think about the regulatory landscape, it's clear that this incoming administration is prioritizing reducing regulatory complexity and confusion for business. And I would submit that the cybersecurity environment has gotten more regulated and more confusing in terms of that regulation in the last 4 years. And a big reason why it has is because Congress hasn't passed any laws, and you have a bunch of different federal agencies and states and governments around the world jumping in and trying to influence US companies.
And
Uh,
executive orders.
and they're doing it through executive orders and enforcement actions. And like if you hit pause on talking about cybersecurity for a second, you could just flip over to crypto and you would see the exact same kind of dance that's happened the last 4 years with more attention. Like those of us in cybersecurity, we think about and stress about like this complexity that's come to us. But the exact same things happened, honestly, in AI, but particularly in cryptocurrency, where like the government has just stood on the sidelines and kind of been, yeah, we don't know what's good or bad yet, so we're not going to legislate, and we're not even going to give clear regulatory guidance. But if we don't like it, we're going to come in and spank you. And that's what Coinbase and a lot of companies have been dealing with the last 4 years, and it's really hard to run a business in that world. And that's why we're going to see a committed shift and change in the AI and crypto space. And I feel like the same thing is going to, at a minimum, trickle down into cybersecurity. That would be my one prediction, is that there'll be less regulation by enforcement, more transparency about expectations, like create like the people who are tech focused, who Trump is bringing in. Like I don't think they want to destroy all regulation. They want to make clear, simple lines of regulation.
It's interesting how this new term, the second term, he's got a lot more high-tech people involved in his, tight ecosystem than the first term. So, I mean, on one hand, maybe it's good. On the other hand, I don't know. Are they going to be pushing for policies that benefit their own sector of the tech world versus for the entire tech world?
I think you'll see push, as Joe said, for less regulation, simplicity, but not less focus on cyber. Like we're not going to devalue the criticality of it, because people who, at least we know, involved right now, right, whether it's Elon or others, they understand the value and criticality of cyber and the security in general. So I don't think we'll see defocus there. It's more about regulation, moving faster, right, enabling innovation, but I don't see us saying that security is not going to be critical, especially around critical infrastructure, government agencies, just in general.
Yeah, I mean, the world has changed in the last 4 years in terms of the criticality of cyber. It's gone up. It's gone up in contexts that people don't think about, whether it's the drone warfare stuff that's going on in a few different countries right now, or what's happening in terms of trying to prevent AI from falling in the wrong hands and going too fast. Like I I would submit that the best thing that could happen from our standpoint is to have people inside power and government who actually understand the importance and the risk, and actually understand how the technology works. That's the part that's been frustrating forever, is taking that trip to Washington D.C. and then sitting down and talking with someone, and then their eyes glaze over in 5 minutes. You're like, what's the point of this meeting?
Well, also think that any future conflict with the near peer, or not even that, where two regions are going at each other, the first wave is going to be cyber. And it's not going to be localized. So I think that is really well known now by DoD and others, and they're racing to make sure that is important. It's really just going to be who's fighting over budget and who has point, really. So it's not about whether it's going to get done or not. It's going to be who gets to lead the charge, so to say.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
I think Trump's foreign policies aren't gonna be, friendlier to some of the countries that we're already at odds with, right? So, the some of the conflicts gonna probably escalate, and which will mean, with China, I don't know what's gonna happen with Russia, but um, and EU is every time I travel to EU, I talk to the security leaders. A lot of them are looking at their country or their region, or sort of becoming more insular in the sense that building their own infrastructure, building their own products, as opposed to relying on us. So there will be, I think cyber is going to be a very, very interesting frontier, right?
That's a really great point, Jiangxi. I mean, I actually think there are two key points in what you just made. But like one of the key points of like over the last 20 years, it's felt like there's been a convergence of tech platforms. Like it used to be like if you sat down 15 years ago with someone from the NSA, they were working, they lived in a completely different tech stack. They used completely different types of phones than you did. Everything was different. And now, they might be in a gov cloud, but they're in a cloud. They might be using a slightly different flavor of Android or iOS, but like they're living in the same tech worlds. And it would be the same when you went overseas. Starting with the sanctions against Russia, forcing them to stop using some Western software, starting with like China trying to prioritize their local and the EU with their regulation requiring data to be stored locally. We're, like as a venture capitalist, how do you think about that fragmentation? We had this convergence, which made it easier for the whole world to sell technology and to use technology globally. And now, are we seeing a fragmentation? Do you think that fragmentation is going to continue?
I think I'm absolutely seeing fragmentation, and not only the traditional fragmentation, like getting more difficult to sell into Asia and China specifically. It's actually getting more difficult to sell into some of the large European companies. Because some of them actually do business with their governments, and their governments are pushing them to use local technologies, local infrastructure. And some of it is due to data security constraints. Others are actually somewhat stemmed from fostering local tech innovations. I had a really interesting conversation with used to be a DPA of a European country, and he said to me over dinner, I'm not going to name which country. It's a really interesting viewpoint. He said the reason he said a lot of new innovations coming from China, like TikTok and all that, is because he said China stopped using Western technology. And so that created a market for local companies to sell, right? And that created demand for local talents. And talents are no longer like all coming to the US in droves because there's more demand locally for innovation. So that actually helped it, in his view, was a positive feedback loop. And he said the European talents the European countries were losing talents to US because all the innovations done in US and European countries just buying our products. So there's no reason to make a career in Europe. They all come here. And he said European countries should start doing what China's doing so that their talents will stay and then will create innovations locally. And I thought that was a very interesting viewpoint. I hadn't heard that from others.
Right.
I, I yeah.
Isn't that just going to be the propagation of the cyber industrial complex? Sorry, you heard it here first, but I had to say that. Like, if there's a dollar to be made here, there's a dollar to be made in isolationism of each country, right? Because that's instead of one company doing the same thing, that's 10 companies you get to start up to do the same thing. So
Mhm.
that's, you know, if there's a dollar to be made, it will be made. And then it's just funny to watch the pendulum swing back and forth and back and forth. It's like isolationism, and then suddenly, big tech will do something and it will become broad again. It's what we called the internet, then we called it cloud or mobile. It's the same thing happening over and over. I might be
But
simple. I apologize.
no, on the one hand, it seems like there has been this fragmentation over the last 4 years, or maybe even longer period of time, as countries are asserting their sovereignty and pushing for more local. But on the other hand, like the top 11 companies in the world, nine of them are tech companies based in the U.S. And those companies haven't gone down in valuation in number of users or quality of product or volume of products going out. Um, so like I'm not sure the data supports the fragmentation. It might be a little bit that ex regulator from the EU country. It's wishful thinking. They want to put they want the genie back in the they want their genies to stay in their bottle. But like they're all still leaking to the United States.
But there's
Um,
no genie.
right.
But I
There's
think
What, you
nothing
don't believe in 10x engineers?
in this, but there's nothing in the bottle. I just I'm gonna stop there.
nothing in the but I think that that data is today, right, Joe? So if you a fast if no, it's fragmenting today. Fast forward 10 years, you might see two, three large companies formed entering into the top 10 that are not from the US. And that's because the fragmentation today. So
I think in EU is not whether they invest enough internally, right, within the region. It's regulation. Like I talked to a number of people said it's impossible to start a new business. Why? Because there's so much red tape, right? In China, I'm sure there is red tape, but it's all sponsored by the government, right? So it's much easier probably to move forward. And tell me one of the last thing they actually innovated. A lot of the technology been taken from somebody else, right? And just evolved on the top of it, which is fine. That's how you grow. But Europe, I think one of the biggest problems right now is there's just too much red tape. There's a lot of smart people. I mean, we see startups there that are really good, both in cyberspace and just technology in general. It's just for them to grow and attract the right talent. I think one, regulation needs to change, and two, compensation. I remember I saw a thread over the holiday. I can't remember. I think it was on LinkedIn. People were talking about pay and comparison between US and I think they were talking about maybe France. I don't remember if it was all of EU. And we're literally talking 5x, if not close to 10x difference in compensation. And look
yeah.
at cyber, right? If you CISO in Europe versus CISO in US, the compensation is drastically different. So if they want to attract talent or retain talent, we're going to have to change how we think about compensation and
If you're a CISO in Europe, you've made a terrible career move.
It's a different profession.
yeah.
It
It is.
is.
I spend a lot of time.
Regulatory, right?
I've spent a lot of time over there in 2024, and it a lot more of the people in the profession are moving. Like they share two hats. You know, they're the data protection officer as well as the cybersecurity officer, and so there are a lot more people coming in from a legal background, a lot less people coming in from a technical background, a lot more people taking the role from a governance background standpoint. But like to Vitaly's point, people are always like, give me a concrete example of how regulation impacted, how European regulation was detrimental. I have a concrete example. I was working with a company, it was over a decade ago, and that company needed to put their first data center in to serve Europe. And I was part of this project where we looked at every country, and you guys are probably smiling because you've probably been through this exact conversation. And it's like, the data center team is like, okay, we care about power, temperature, and water. This country looks great. And that country was France. Let me just say, after the lawyers got involved, the data center did not get built in France. A decade plus later, the data center is thriving, and there's a whole community. There's a whole community of engineers in the country where the data center is because that country was and then more business followed, and we were the first ones to build a data center in that country, and then lots of other companies started investing in that country because it was like, and none of them went to France, right?
Nor will that be coming
French
anytime soon.
But
French cultures.
Yeah, it's way more than just data regulation. It's like Vitaly knows a lot about this, but workforce and workforce management and like legality of how many hours they can work and whatnot. And being an American company and then trying to operate there is
yes,
sobering.
you learn about works councils and all those
Oh God.
So,
things.
uh, but I am seeing this pressure of let's have our European stack, let's have our European cloud, and now like let's have our European AI models. Um, do you guys think it's gonna last? Do you think it's gonna um so as Jim said, there's money to be made in Europe and investing in companies potentially that are serving the European market. But what do you think the Trump administration is going to do? Are we going to be more friendly to Europe and continue this US is your tech hub kind of thing? Or do you think we are going to have policies which will foster this further fragmentation? And Asia and China is a different thing, but I'm interested in our relationship with the European countries. And Joe, you might have a very interesting view given your involvement with Ukraine.
Yeah, I was talking to a senior government official who was thinking about leaving government, and uh, he was seeking some advice on like the path into the private sector. And
Sorry.
um,
So
on the topic of U.S. companies and how they're perceived overseas and how we perceive them in the U.S., I think this senior government official said to me not too long ago, Joe, all you people who work at American companies, you don't understand the way the world thinks about companies. And I was like, what are you talking about? He said, every company is an extension of its government. He's like, and this person has spent a lot of time thinking about China, but he's like, it's the case everywhere. When a country thinks about how it projects power and has power in the world, they consider their companies part of the state. In the United States, we just don't think that way. Like Silicon Valley doesn't think of itself that way.
yeah,
But at the end of the day, in the same way that McDonald's is a projection of American values and something else and whatever, so are our tech companies, and our tech companies are global and they have influence everywhere. And the rest of the world views them in the same way they view Hollywood as projecting American values into their environment. And they believe that the United States government has a bigger say in how these companies are run than probably the people outside the companies would feel.
interesting. Huh.
It's just terrifying, actually.
But come on, Jim, you know that if you said, is every Chinese company an extension of the Chinese government, what would you say?
Absolutely. Matter of fact, it's required by law.
True. I would say that's not true. So to look at what happened to Ant Financial, right? So they got shut down. They are
Be-
an independent company. They didn't even get their IPO. So it does happen.
because they drifted from.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so that 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 was an example to say that not every company is necessarily an extension of the government, and maybe the ones that are not as successful. But Ant got really successful, in terms of business, that is, and then so but anyway, the point is that when everybody else look at that way, so does that mean that it'll impede US companies' expansion in the world because they think of it as extension of US government? Are
I, I
they going
think I think that the governments of the rest of the world have always viewed U.S. companies that way. I think we have naively not viewed ourselves that way. And I think that with Elon Musk being seen globally as close to the incoming president and all these tech leaders going to the inauguration and all the things that are happening now, it's going to cement that interpretation. And it's going to be, I think it's going to be an interesting struggle for U.S. companies to navigate that, because they like to think of each company likes to think of itself as having different values, different priorities, and wants to navigate the world on its own. I'm talking about the large ones.
yeah.
And most of these companies have the GDP of a nation within themselves, right? So they kind of are their own country in a way. And they also act very much the same way. I just said at a dinner, I said tech will always do the right thing when it's their last choice, right? And I think that I might regret saying that, but um, yeah,
I'd like you to elaborate on that, Jim. Tech will always do the right thing when it's their last choice. So,
like so we wouldn't need regulation if tech would actually manage a lot of data sovereignty issues and other things together. Um, but since they just straight up compete with each other viciously over cloud footprints or whatever, we end up with complex scenarios that require regulation, right? There's too many lawyers involved. No offense, Joe. There's too many lawyers.
Not a lawyer.
Fair point. Um, there's too many lawyers involved, and we end up in these scenarios of just delay until the FTC sues you, and then okay, maybe we'll do something, but that's government intervention at that point, right? So, as much as there's concern about tech being involved with the incoming administration, I think that we're seeing a change in attitude of how tech relates with government, especially public. And we might actually benefit from
I agree with you. As someone
that.
who I'm shocked. I agree with you. But
Okay.
as someone who used to have to live in the weeds of content moderation and trying to sort through all that stuff, it was often the case that I would like look at this group of people sitting in Silicon Valley trying to make these decisions impacting consumers across the planet and think, like, who are we to be making these decisions? Like we're not dialed into the geopolitical implications. Every country does have different values and priorities, and it's their government, and it's like their government was chosen by them, and their standards were chosen by them, and and I often felt like I would like to get my company out of this business of deciding whether A is okay to be shown versus B is okay to be shown versus C. It's really complicated, and I didn't think we were qualified. And I would like to see qualified people in government thinking about it, but qualified people have been thinking for hundreds or thousands of years about speech, and we count on our government to get involved in that.
that's a difficult thing because if you're a global company, then US government may think about free speech in a way that is very different than the Irish government, the French government, Chinese government. And then I guess it's not more complex than what you deal with today, but if every country has their own filter.
What
What do you think
Well, we
this?
already have that today.
that's we've been dealing with that for 25 years. I mean, in 2001 at eBay, we had to make decisions differently about who could see what content. Like Nazi memorabilia is like a collectible in the United States that somebody is interested in studying World War II. If you sell that in Germany or France, that's a crime. And so tech companies have been forking their product experience forever. It's a
And
lot easier to actually fork it on the front end than the back end. I think it's um, like one of the things I think that's gonna not change very much is the reality of like if you're one of these large global tech companies, you don't like forking your product, so you do evolve to the strictest regulation on the back end. Like GDPR is an example. Like when we were working through GDPR at Facebook, we didn't want to have one tech stack that handles customer data in one way and another tech stack that like you can't run the same product. If you and I are interacting on Facebook and you're sitting in Europe and I'm sitting in the United States, we need one back end. And so companies will fork the front end to comply, but they generally will not fork the back end. And so in this world of fragmentation you're talking about, it's just going to cause a bunch of architectural product difficult decisions on the front and the back end.
And it's not just social moderation, right? It's around security policy, notification policy, just in general. Every country has different set of rules that we have to comply. So it's actually no different that we've been operating for many years.
And cloud really amplified that when everybody said, okay, our data needs to reside in our country. And then suddenly we're building mini data centers all over Europe and wherever to deal with that.
So, I mean, that's, this is a really interesting viewpoint. I hadn't thought about forking front end versus forking back end, and obviously back end infrastructure is harder. And so if you are dealing with different constraints, like how you tag the data, how you like go into where data can go and everything, so that clearly you're going to do a high watermark kind of thing, right, for your back end. That's interesting. But one other thing I want to touch on that before we go is everybody expects that Trump administration is going to be having a light touch on regulation, which is typically friendly to businesses. So that's a good thing. But it could have adverse effect on consumer protection, for instance, privacy, right? So if you get rid of privacy regulations, then there's no protection for consumer data. So how do you expect, what do you expect as CISO? Some of you, I think both of you, Jim and Vitaly, you guys have privacy, right? Yeah.
Privacy engineering. Yeah.
Privacy engineering. So what do you think it's going to happen to privacy policies? And are you expect something different to execute going forward? Why and why
No,
not?
I mean, we follow the state in many cases probably anyway, right? So California CPAA has a much higher level of standard than federal does. New York has it. There's many states now moving in their own privacy legislation. So I don't think, first of all, we're going to see deregulation in privacy space, but I don't think it would have much impact on a lot of our day-to-day work. It's because we have to comply with a lot of different policies at the state level.
I would be really appreciative if the federal government did pass a federal privacy regulation act, whatever you want to call it, so I don't have to deal with 50 states.
They're not going to do it. I mean,
know they're not going to do it, but
yeah.
this is my call for help.
Yeah, and Jim, would you agree that since we have to comply with things like GDPR anyway, that's a higher level bar for almost anything that federal has in US, or even at the state level?
But that's
Not
not
every,
the problem. The problem is, how do I identify which users in what state, and how does this comply? And is it by address, or is it by geo, or is
Yeah.
it by IP address, or is it by where their mom lives? And every state declares it differently. So if so for proactive stuff, it's okay. But for reactive, if you have an incident or something like that, I have to immediately call an outside law firm just to decipher what the current rule set is across 50 states. And I'm mired in paperwork for the next 6 months.
Okay.
Lawyers. If you weaponize that process, you could, if you just went around and if you're a nation state and went around and popped companies just enough so that they had to report, you would bring us down to a crawling halt.
It's an interesting DDoS practice.
Yeah.
Hey, we do. We do have from 2024 one example of a ransomware org kind of reaching out to regulators to time out a company that wasn't paying. So the precedent has been set. And we always hear that cybercrime, like the cyber criminals have now industrialized and operate like a company. How soon before they have their own legal teams?
I'm sure they already have their legal team.
No, it'd be, while we're on a list of things that would be cool, things that I've asked for is like, we have great intelligence capabilities. We should get Title 10 powers. We should get Title 10 powers as companies to be able to at least defensively strike back and defend ourselves from an attacker.
You're going to reopen the old hackback legislation conversation?
So,
Yes.
Jim, just explain to our listeners what Title 10 is. Not everyone.
Title 10 means reference the United States government or DoD that you have offensive capabilities. You have the authorities to execute offensive capabilities.
So
Yeah.
that that's really interesting.
Yeah.
And
So Title 50 is you have the ability to collect intelligence, so on and so forth. So I am not going to peel the onion on this much more outside of that. That is just one thing on my Christmas list. Boy, that would be fun. But
Just
then
have
no,
we,
but
it would
Hey,
be a
what makes you think you can't do it already?
Joe, why are you opening this? You know I can't talk about
no,
this.
no. We just don't call it Title 10, right?
Right.
It's called the bounty.
okay,
Bounty.
let me ask this
Hey,
way.
if
You think
if someone forgets to register their domain and it's sitting out there, I don't know. There's things that can be done,
Well, you can also,
and that have been done.
I think I read somewhere you could, I'm not sure how this would work. I've never done it, but I think you could hire like third parties in foreign countries to act on your behalf. But I think I read that in Tom Clancy novel or something.
Probably.
that was one of my questions is Trump had in the past demonstrated his willingness to go offensive. So do you think no? Do you think there will be more offensive capabilities that he's pushing to build, or his
Yeah,
DHS will be either they push to build or allow you guys to build?
At the federal level, 100% we're going to continue investing in that, right? We have to keep up. At the enterprise level, no, I don't see that wish coming to fruition
Oh,
for
but it'd
him.
be great because if they gave me Title 10, the first person I'm attacking is you.
Jim's gonna do it.
It's
he
just,
says, "Bring it."
could you imagine if they gave us that authority? It would just, the internet would melt down with attacks. It's just like
Within a
30
second.
years.
I would.
Instances.
I was thinking about this the other day. You know what would be a really cool podcast to
Yep.
have to bring on two security leaders and basically have them battle it out over who has a better security team. Like, why don't we have competition between security organizations and be like, look, I've got three talented people in this category, you got nothing. And like because we don't actually talk about how you build a good like there's no public conversation about how you build a good security team. What are the differences between the quality of teams?
That's
It was, at the end of the year on LinkedIn, like you see these pop-ups of everybody's like, I was a top 10 CISO in 2024. And I'm like,
that's you, Phil. You're out there somewhere, but I'm talking about you. I know you pay them off to do that, Phil. I will
Joe,
find
are
you.
you saying we need a federated red team model here?
I'm saying nobody should get CISO of the year unless their team could kick somebody else's team's butt.
That would be a most boring podcast, first of all. But make a really good like CTF at Black Hat or something, just having two companies go
Well,
at
hold
it.
on. It actually would be if we discussed the content, if we discussed it in the context of how to run a security or organization inside of a large company, right? So, like, what methodology do you use? Do you lock everything down? Do you create secure paths? Because I'm pretty sure at least Joe and I would get in a fight. Vitaly and I would probably agree. But it's like, do you use a federated model? How do you run
Yeah.
a security program
Yep.
that's effective while dealing with developers?
By
Which
the way, that is a great topic. Yeah, that's actually a lot of people would be interested to hear it. How do you build successful security program and what that looks like at scale?
I think I'm interested in that. Maybe a good thing is to make it really tight. Like discuss it based on the framework, so that people can listen to it and really take lessons away. So that could be a good topic for one of the future episodes. Just one last thing before we close out. Joe, you included too, even though you're not a sitting CISO, maybe. So, name the top thing you think you will change. You might have to change because the new administration. Jim, start with you.
my first reaction is not the response that I should be giving. I think that with the new administration coming in, if you have AI capabilities or your business is AI dependent, you should be really focused on what policy could be coming out of the government around AI and trying to influence them.
All right. Vitali?
Nothing we're going to change, right? Our strategy, our priorities are still the same. They're tied to the business needs. Administration is not really going to change that for us. We do have to keep an eye, as Jim said, on the AI side of it, right? Because it's going to move very, very quickly in terms of whether it's regulation or deregulation, expert compliance changes around where we can actually send chips or we can't, right? So if you're in the hardware side of the business, you have to be mindful, but there's no change right now.
And Joe, what's your prediction?
Well, I'm working with a few different companies right now, a couple public and a couple of smaller, and I do think that the change in administration is an important time for people to engage. I agree with Jim's point, paying really not just paying a close attention to what's happening on AI policy, but getting more involved. I think this is an administration where technologists will actually be heard, and because they're going to be technologists involved in decision making, and so I think this is a real opportunity. If there are people in our community who have strong points of view, we should, if we don't speak up and communicate them, those points of view are not going to be heard and they're not going to be implemented. So a lot of concrete policies around crypto, around AI, and around cybersecurity are going to come out of the next 4 years. And once policies get locked, they're hard to change. And so what I hope happens is that we have a lot more engagement.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Jim.
I just want to amplify that and carefully say that regardless of politics or disposition of how you feel, what Joe said is very important. Please come help. Please get involved. It's not a political rally every time you go into the room. Actually, you're talking about policy. You're talking about defending America or making America more competitive or how to engage in X, Y, or Z. Really, really, really important that we get involved and help. Higgins 2028.
My one thing is I actually have been seeing interesting innovations that within the AI and programming realm that could potentially make secure by design a reality. I'm very excited about that. So, well, with that, this is great. First podcast, first episode for 2025. A lot more to come. And